Okay, so just to start, I actually used to be a professional fighter, and I'm only moderately less nervous for this talk than I was, for example, fighting 90% naked in front of tens of thousands of people. So with that said, this is work I've done recently under the supervision of Maya Fraser at the University of Ottawa, and I'd also like to thank Doina Prekup for her guidance and suggestions as well for this work. You mentioned this is a wacky keyboard. How do I? Oh, okay. So the motivation. Motivation. So as David Silver mentioned, Peter Beals mentioned throughout this week, we learn from kind of a vector of reward signals. We learn from a vector of kind of perspective. So if I raise my arm up like this, I know that that sequence of actions was good for raising my arm roughly in the plane, my hand came up, my wrist came up, and etc., etc. So if my goal is just to raise my arm up, my hand up, and that's all I've ever done, and I'm giving a new task, raise your elbow up, I at least already know this is a pretty good estimate. I also like the idea of landmarks. So I think, I live in Ottawa, I don't know how to get to everywhere in Ottawa, but I maintain landmarks in memory, and these kind of give me some sort of covering of my state space to get around. So when I explain to people the landmark options, basically what I ask them is, what's 12 times 13? And typically when I ask them, I don't care how they did it, what the answer is, but I ask how they did it. And typically people will say, I did 12 times 12, and then I added 12. And so we kind of maintain, so I'd say 12 times 12 is a landmark. So we maintain these kind of landmarks and some sort of covering of these landmarks, and we know how to kind of get to states nearby these landmarks. And so that's kind of the main intuition behind what I'm doing. So this is multitask reinforcement learning. So we give it a sequence of tasks, and these tasks are basically parameterized by episodic MDPs, and they are essentially parameterized by goal states. So the episode ends when you reach a goal state. No matter what the agent does, they get a slap on the wrist, they're always told bad, and so the agent has impetus to get to the goal state as quickly as possible. I won't explain the options framework, I assume people are familiar with it, but we have a set of landmarks, and this is simply a subset of the state space. And with every landmark in our set, we have an associated landmark option and an associated landmark-centric value function. So David Silver kind of was talking about this with goals. And so these landmark-centric value functions tell us how good we are in terms of getting towards that landmark. And the nice thing under this framework with gamma equal to 1, the optimal landmark-centric value function is the negative expected number of steps from where we are to our landmark. And so this is a two-phase learning process. In the first phase, basically, the agent, I like to think of it as free play. It's a pre-learning phase. The agent has some sort of arbitrary exploration policy, behavior policy, and is doing off-policy learning with regard to how to get to each of these landmarks. The only assumption I have is by the end of the pre-learning phase, you have some sort of alpha optimal value function for each of these landmark value functions. And then the phase 2 begins. That's when we basically put our agent to work. We start assigning a sequence of tasks. And the thing that we have that's special here is, though the agent is restricted to only primitive actions in the first phase, in the second phase, the agent now has a policy that maps to not just primitive actions, but this ability to reflect. And so we have all these landmark options, but we restrict access to these landmark options. So if the agent wants to select a landmark option, it has restricted access. It has to first reflect. And so you can see this, if you're familiar with the separation of concerns framework, you can see this as an aggregator function. And so when the agent selects the reflection action, it essentially takes the landmark option, OL, associated to the landmark state and the landmark value function that maximizes the goal state. And so we use this as a surrogate kind of estimate of how the landmark that's closest to the goal state. The termination function we define, so when I decide to take a certain landmark option, I can evaluate what's the value of my current state with regard to getting to my goal state, my landmark. and that value function is the estimated number, the expected number of steps. And so when I take more than the expected number of steps, that's when I terminate this landmark option. And it's just treated as any other action subject to learning constraints, learning updates. So I believe in starting small, starting simple, gradually making things more complex. We build a nice intuition about your problem. And so under simple settings, I'm running out of time, but under simple settings, deterministic domain, finite state space, we have lifelong regret bounds. And some simple experimental results. So unfortunately, doesn't all fit on one slide. But, so this is grid will domain 15 by 15, deterministic and stochastic, and essentially we give the agent a sequence of 100 arbitrary random tasks. Each task runs for 1,000 episodes, and the regret after every episode is recorded, and we repeat the experiments 100 times. Our implementation is with Q-learning as a baseline, and Q-learning augmented with the LOVR framework. And basically, as you would expect, as you add more and more landmarks to the repertoire, you see a decrease in cumulative lifelong regret. Moreover, if you look at, so denoted A subscript O, this is a LOVR implementation where the agent can take primitive actions, it can take the ability to reflect, but it can also now, it's not restricted access to the landmark options. It can select landmark options as well. And it does have a reduction in cumulative lifelong regret, but it's not as pronounced, it's not as significant as if you purely restrict the access of the landmark options through the ability to reflect. And so with that, I invite you to visit my poster. Please read the paper. Thank you.